Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's often really misunderstood, even stigmatized.
Yeah,
We're talking about borderline personality disorder,
BPD.
BPD.
Yeah.
And to get this right, we're going way beyond the surface, beyond just the label itself, to explore really like the inner world of BPD.
Yeah.
Specifically, these thought patterns that both define and challenge the BPD experience, right?
I'm so glad we're doing this,
Yeah.
because understanding those thought patterns, it's not just about clinical definitions, right? It's about understanding the why behind the behaviors, the emotional intensity, the relationship struggles.
It's like we've all had moments, right, where our emotions just feel huge and maybe they even lead us to act in ways that we later regretted. But for someone with BPD, those moments, those feelings, they're often the norm. And they're fueled by these thought patterns that can feel like a constant internal tug of war,
Yeah, and that's where things can get really tricky. Because from the outside looking in, those behaviors, they might seem confusing, irrational even, maybe even hurtful. But today, we're going to unpack the underlying thought processes that drive those behaviors.
I love it. Think of it like this. You're getting a glimpse behind the curtain. You're going to see the machinery that's driving the show, even if it's not always running smoothly.
Right, exactly.
And hopefully, by the end of this deep dive, you'll have some new tools for navigating BPD, whether it's something you personally experience or you're trying to support someone who does.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, especially when we're talking about mental health.
100%. Okay, so let's get into it. One of the key concepts we're going to explore today is something called distorted thinking. Now, before anyone freaks out, this isn't about labeling anyone as wrong or bad. It's about recognizing that when we talk about distorted thinking, we're really just talking about ways the brain tries to cope with really intense emotions, which are often rooted in past experiences.
It's like imagine your brain is trying to process like a ton of emotional data, but some of the filters, they're malfunctioning.
Okay, I like that. So the information's coming in, but it's not necessarily being processed accurately.
Exactly. And that can lead to a disconnect between what's actually happening and how it's being perceived. It's like looking at the world through a lens that's slightly warped.
Which can explain why communication can be so difficult, right? Because if you're both looking at the same situation, but you're seeing completely different things.
Precisely. And that's where empathy becomes so crucial. Because it's not about saying you're wrong. It's about trying to understand how they arrived at that conclusion in the first place.
Okay, that's super helpful. So we've got this idea of distorted thinking. But what does that actually look like in real life? Let's dive into 3 of the most common thought distortions that are associated with BPD, starting with black and white thinking.
Okay, black and white thinking. Think of it as seeing the world in extremes, like you said earlier, with the volume, cranked all the way up. Everything is either amazing or awful, good or bad, with very little in between.
So nuance is out the window.
Pretty much, yeah. And you can see how this would create chaos in relationships, right? Because one minute, the partner might be the perfect soulmate, and then a minor disagreement happens. Maybe they forget to pick up the dry cleaning or something. Suddenly, they're the enemy. It's like a light switch flipping back and forth, and the other person is left reeling, trying to figure out what just happened.
Wow, that black and white thinking really resonates. I can see how that would create so much instability, both for the person with BPD and for their loved ones.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that these aren't intentional choices, It's not that the person with BPD is trying to be manipulative or dramatic. These are deeply ingrained thought patterns that they may not even be aware of.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, that's black and white thinking. Next up on our list of BPD thought distortions is catastrophic thinking. This one sounds intense.
It can be. Imagine this. You send a text to your partner, and they don't reply right away. Maybe they're in a meeting or driving or their phone's on silent. Most of us would think, no answer yet. Oh well, I'm sure they'll get back to me soon. But with catastrophic thinking, that unanswered text, it becomes a 5-alarm fire.
Oh man, I know that feeling. It's like suddenly my brain goes to the worst case scenario, even if it makes absolutely no sense.
Exactly. And for someone with BPD, that catastrophic thinking can just spiral out of control. Suddenly that unanswered text means they're being ghosted, the relationship is over, they're gonna die alone, surrounded by cats.
Okay, well maybe not that last part.
Well, maybe. But you get my point. It's like that one worry, that unanswered text, it becomes a portal to all the worst fears and insecurities.
Yes. Catastrophic thinking takes a normal worry and just blows it completely out of proportion.
And it creates this incredibly intense fear and anxiety that can be really hard to manage.
And that spiral can lead to some pretty intense reactions, right? Maybe even like self-sabotaging behaviors.
Yeah.
Because if you're convinced that the worst is about to happen, you might do things that you wouldn't normally do, all to try and escape that perceived disaster, right?
Exactly. It's like that old saying, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Except in this case, the they is often their own brain.
Wow, okay. So we've got black and white thinking, we've got catastrophic thinking. Last but not least, tell us about emotional reasoning. This is our next stop on the BPD thought pattern train.
With emotional reasoning, feelings basically become facts.
Okay, I've totally been there.
Yeah.
Like when you feel rejected, so you just conclude that you are unlovable,
Yeah.
even if there's no actual evidence to support that.
Exactly. And that's the thing with emotional reasoning. It can feel so real, so undeniably true, even when it's not based in like actual reality. So if someone with BPD is feeling abandoned, even if logically, they know their partner is there for them, that feeling of abandonment, it becomes their reality and they might react accordingly.
And those reactions can run the gamut, right? From
Yeah.
withdrawing, shutting down, to like lashing out, pushing people away.
Absolutely. It's like their emotions are calling the shots and logic has to take a back seat. And it makes sense if you think about it. If you feel something strongly enough, doesn't it feel real, even if it isn't?
Totally. So with emotional reasoning, we're not talking about just being overly sensitive or anything like that.
Yeah.
We're talking about genuinely perceiving the world through this filter of really intense emotions.
Exactly. And imagine trying to have a rational conversation when your own emotions are telling you one thing, even if logic is saying something completely different. It's incredibly difficult to navigate.
It makes total sense why communication can be so tricky for folks with BPD, especially during those like really emotionally charged moments.
Right. And it's not just about communication with others. It's about the internal experience of BPD, which can be just as, if not more, intense.
Okay, so we've got the what of these thought patterns down, but expert speaker, what's it actually like to live with this inner chaos day to day?
Yeah.
For someone with BPD, what's going on inside their head?
Okay, imagine this. You're trying to focus on a conversation, but your mind is racing a mile a minute. Thoughts are flying in every direction. It's like your brain is stuck on fast forward. I'm trying to make sense of it all, but it's just, so overwhelming. You just want it to stop.
Okay, whoa, that's a lot.
Yeah.
But I think I get it.
Right, sorry. Got a little carried away there. But seriously, one of the things that comes with BPD is this feeling of what we call cognitive overload, where it's like your brain is short-circuiting, basically.
Yeah.
And that's a key reason why communication can be so hard, right? Because if you can barely hold on to a thought yourself, how are you supposed to explain it to someone else, let alone process what they're saying to you?
It's like trying to have a conversation while someone's like blasting a fire hose of thoughts and emotions directly into your brain. No wonder it's so exhausting.
Precisely. And that exhaustion, it can lead to misunderstandings, maybe even withdrawal, because sometimes it just feels easier to shut down than try to explain what can't be explained.
Okay, so that's cognitive overload, which frankly sounds terrifying. What about this idea of identity disturbance, which I know is a big one with BPD? What does that actually feel like?
Imagine looking in the mirror and not even recognizing yourself. Not in a physical way, but feeling like you're a different person at different times. Your goals, your values, your beliefs, even your favorite color. It's like they're constantly shifting and you're just along for the ride.
So it's not just like being flaky or indecisive, like some people might assume.
Right.
It's this much deeper struggle with a core sense of self.
Exactly. And this shifting self-image can impact every aspect of someone's life, from their career choices to their relationships. Because how do you build a life? How do you make commitments when you don't know who you are from one day to the next,
It's got to be incredibly disorienting, not just for the person with BPD, but for the people around them too, right?
Yeah.
It's like, how can you truly know someone if they don't even know who they are?
You're hitting on a really important point, which is that BPD doesn't exist in a vacuum. You know? These thought patterns, these internal struggles, they have a ripple effect. And that's what we're going to explore next, how BPD impacts relationships and what we can do to navigate those challenges with compassion and understanding.
Yes, because as much as we need to understand what's going on inside the mind of someone with BPD, we also need to understand how those internal experiences actually play out in their interactions with others.
Exactly. And that's where things can get really complicated, because when you have these intense emotions, these distorted thought patterns, it inevitably impacts the way you relate to the people around you, especially the people closest to you.
And that's where we often see those like classic BPD relationship patterns emerge, right? Like the fear of abandonment, the push and pull dynamic, the intense need for reassurance.
Yeah, you got it. And it's not because people with BPD are trying to be difficult or manipulative. It's because they're operating from this place of like deep-seated fear, insecurity, and oftentimes past trauma.
And when those fears get triggered, even if it's totally unintentional, it can just like create so much turmoil in the relationship.
Absolutely. And for the partner, it can be incredibly challenging to navigate. It's like walking through a minefield where you don't know where the next explosion is going to come from.
So let's talk about that. What are some of the challenges that partners of people with BPD often face? Because I think it's important to remember that BPD doesn't just affect the individual.
Right.
It affects everyone in their orbit.
100%. And one of the biggest challenges partners often describe is this feeling of emotional whiplash. Remember that black and white thinking we talked about?
Oh, yeah.
Imagine feeling like you're constantly adapting to those sudden shifts in emotions. One minute, you're the best thing since sliced bread. The next minute, you can't do anything right.
Yeah, I was going to say, that sounds exhausting.
It is.
Not just for the person with BPD, but for their partner, too.
Exactly. It creates this like constant state of uncertainty and instability in the relationship. And for the partner, it can be really hard to feel secure and loved when they never know what version of their partner they're going to get, you know?
And I imagine it also makes it really difficult to know how to support them, because what might be helpful one day might totally backfire the next.
That's exactly it. And it's not for lack of trying, you know? Partners of people with BPD, they often bend over backwards to be understanding and supportive. But even the best intentions can get lost in translation when you're dealing with these like intense and often unpredictable emotions.
So we've got emotional whiplash. What else? What are some of the other challenges that can pop up in these relationships?
Well, on top of that emotional roller coaster, you've got the misinterpretations that can come from those distorted thinking patterns we talked about earlier.
Can you give us an example? Because I think it would be really helpful to like see how this actually plays out in real life.
Sure. Let's say the person with BPD is feeling overwhelmed and just needs some space.
Yeah.
Totally understandable, right? We all need some alone time sometimes. But a partner who's not familiar with BPD might see that withdrawal as rejection. They might think, oh no, they don't want to be around me. When in reality, it's really just about the person with BPD trying to regulate their own emotions and prevent like a bigger meltdown from happening.
So something that might seem like a personal attack to the partner is actually a coping mechanism for the person with BPD.
Precisely. And those misunderstandings, they can lead to a lot of unnecessary conflict, a lot of hurt feelings, especially if they're not addressed.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of potential for things to get lost in translation.
There really is. And that's why communication is so crucial in these relationships. But it's not just about talking, it's about learning how to communicate effectively, which can be a whole other challenge in itself.
Because even with the best intentions, it can be tough to get on the same page, right?
Yeah.
When you're dealing with such different emotional realities.
Exactly. And then on top of the emotional whiplash and the misinterpretations, there's the emotional labor that partners of people with BPD often take on. And this is something that doesn't always get talked about, but it can be incredibly draining.
What do you mean by emotional labor? Can you like unpack that a little for us?
Sure. So as we've established, folks with BPD, they experience emotions very intensely, right?
Definitely. And our natural instinct, especially with, those we love, is to want to help them feel better, to offer support, to offer reassurance.
Exactly. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to be there for your partner, but constantly providing that support, often at the expense of your own needs, it can lead to resentment. Burnout. It's like running a marathon with no finish line in sight.
Wow. Okay, so we've talked about emotional whiplash, misinterpretations, emotional labor. Is it any surprise that relationships where BPD is present can be so challenging?
It's tough stuff for sure. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, to validate the very real struggles that both partners face.
Absolutely. But before anyone throws their hands up in despair, I want to make sure we shift gears here. Because while we've covered a lot of heavy stuff today, this deep dive is not about dwelling on the challenges.
Right.
It's about finding those glimmers of hope, those strategies for connection and understanding that can make a real difference.
Exactly. It's not a hopeless situation. Understanding these thought patterns, that's a huge first step. But the real power comes from knowing what to do with that knowledge. And luckily, there are some really effective strategies out there for navigating these like complex dynamics in a way that can actually strengthen relationships, not tear them apart.
Okay, good. So let's hear it. What are some of those strategies? What can both partners do to create a more supportive and fulfilling relationship, even when BPD is part of the picture, so expert speaker? Where do we even begin? What does creating a supportive relationship when BPD is involved actually look like? What tools can we use?
Well, I think it all starts with communication, but not just any communication. We're talking
Yeah.
about creating a space of like radical openness and understanding, a space where both partners feel safe to express their thoughts and feelings, without fear of judgment.
Okay, I love that idea.
Yeah.
But how do we actually make that happen? Because, like, when you're in the thick of it, when emotions are running high, that safe space can feel about as attainable as, like, world peace.
Right. It takes work, but it's so worth it. One strategy that can be really helpful is something called open dialogue. And it's exactly what it sounds like, creating a space for like regular structured conversations where both partners can just check in with each other about what's going on internally.
Okay, so it's like a relationship temperature check, but for emotions.
Exactly.
I like it. How would that even work, like in real life?
And you can get creative with it. Maybe you agree to have like a 10-minute feelings check-in every night where you each just share what's going on internally. The good, the bad, the ugly, no judgment. Or maybe you start journaling together as a way to kind of track emotional patterns and identify potential triggers.
Ooh, journaling together. That's a really cool idea. It's like, honey, did you remember to log your feelings today?
Exactly. But in all seriousness, the key is to just find what works for both of you, to create a system that feels, supportive and sustainable. And it has to go both ways, right? The person with BPD needs to feel safe expressing their inner world, and the partner needs to feel heard and understood as well.
That makes total sense. And it actually reminds me of another strategy that's often recommended in the context of BPD, trigger identification. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, so this is where getting to know those thought patterns we discussed earlier really pays off. Once you start to understand what tends to trigger those like really extreme emotions, whether it's certain topics, situations, even specific words or tones of voice, you can start to anticipate them and respond in a way that's more likely to de-escalate the situation rather than make it worse.
So it's like you're learning to navigate a minefield. Once you know where the mines are, you can avoid setting them off. Or at least you'll be better prepared for the explosion.
Precisely. It's not about walking on eggshells. It's about like having the awareness to navigate those sensitive areas with more, more care and understanding.
Okay, that's a really good distinction. So with trigger identification, it's about like noticing those patterns both within yourself and within the relationship, and then using that awareness to, make more conscious choices about how you respond. What about empathy and compassion? Where do those fit into all of this?
We could do a whole deep dive on empathy and compassion alone, but in the context of BPD, they're not just important, they're essential. Because when you're dealing with these intense emotions, these seemingly irrational behaviors, it's so easy to get caught up in the frustration, and forget that the person you love is hurting.
Right, it's definitely easier said than done, because when someone's yelling at you or shutting you out or accusing you of things you didn't do, your first instinct isn't always to be compassionate.
You're absolutely right, and I want to be clear. Empathy and compassion, they do not equal accepting unacceptable behavior. It's not about being a doormat or enabling harmful patterns. It's about like shifting your perspective, about remembering that those behaviors are often coping mechanisms, not personal attacks. It's about seeing the hurting person behind the BPD diagnosis, you know?
It's like that saying, hurt people hurt people. But in this case, it's often more accurate to say, hurting people hurt people. Like, they're not trying to inflict pain.
Yeah.
They're trying to manage their own internal pain, which unfortunately can sometimes spill over onto others.
Exactly. And when both partners can approach the situation with that understanding, it creates space for healing, for connection, even amidst all the challenges.
Wow, this has been such an eye-opening deep dive. We've covered so much, from the very definition of BPD to like the nitty-gritty of how these thought patterns play out in real life, and most importantly, what we can all do about it. But before we wrap up, expert speaker, I have to ask, is there hope for these relationships? Like, when BPD is part of the picture, is a healthy, loving relationship even possible?
Absolutely. In fact, I'd go a step further and say that, navigating these dynamics can sometimes lead to some of the strongest, most resilient relationships out there.
Really?
Yeah.
How so? I think a lot of people, especially those who are like newer to the world of BPD, they might find that hard to believe.
Yeah, it makes sense. But think about it this way. When you're kind of forced to confront these deep-seated thought patterns, to communicate like openly and honestly about your needs, your vulnerabilities, it creates this level of trust and intimacy that many couples, they never even achieve. It's like you're building your relationship on this foundation of radical honesty and acceptance, which can be incredibly powerful.
So in a way, those same challenges that can make BPD relationships so difficult, they can also be like opportunities for incredible growth and self-discovery, both individually and as a couple.
Exactly. And that's what I always want to emphasize, that while BPD presents, unique challenges, it also offers really unique opportunities for growth, for healing, for connection. It's not an easy journey by any means, but it is a journey worth taking.
I love that. So for our listeners out there, whether you're personally navigating BPD or supporting someone who is, remember, understanding those thought patterns, that's just the first step. The real magic happens when you can use that knowledge to build those bridges of empathy, of communication, of like radical compassion. And who knows, you might just come out the other side stronger and more connected than ever before.
Couldn't agree more.
And that is all the time we have for today's deep dive. We covered a lot of ground, but as always, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those conversations going. Until next time, stay curious, my friends.